Hey, hi, this is Sandeep, and welcome to this tutorial in which I'll be explaining you about attribute level validation versus entity level validation versus transactional level validation. Okay, so basically these are the three kinds of validations. So let's go ahead. I have department. I've created the EO and the VOs for department and employees already. So I will go to the employee EO. Okay, quickly. So these are the basically, if you go to the business rules, you will find that these all defined over here. Whatever was existing in the DB, whatever constraint existed, it has defined some validations based on those. Okay, so I will say I want to define attribute level validation, so I will define it over here. Okay, if I want to define an entity level validation, I will define it over here. Okay, so let's create a first name attribute level validation on the first name. It's a simple validation that I'm just going to create. I'm just going to check whether the length is less than, it should be less than or equal to 10 characters. Okay, see, already it is asking me for the error message, so I will provide here. So here is the error message that I will provide, and I will click OK. Okay, so here is our validator. Already there was a validator over here which actually checks whether the character number of characters are 20 or not. It should be less than 20. It's based on the constraint that already exists in the DB, but I have defined a new validator, so it will get fired as I approach a length greater than 10. Okay, so remember, this is an attribute level of validation. So when it gets fired, basically, let's run and test this, that when an attribute level validation gets fired. So here you have the output. I click on this. Now just remember that these are the already existing records which are being pulled from the DB. Just scroll through. We have defined attribute level validation over here, right? First of all, the thing to remember is that attribute level and entity level validation are only fired when you actually try to modify, actually try to make it dirty. Okay, now it's actually based on the on some rules, whatever you make dirty. For example, what I am trying to explain you here is that when the rows are fetched from the DB, these are the records which have already been fetched. Okay, so these, you have defined a validation rule over here that the length should be less than or equal to 10, but if you scroll through, you will see that there is a first name which is this one, Joe's Manor. Now obviously this is greater than length 10, but still it is not giving me any validation. My validation rule that I defined is not triggering. That is because this row has been just fetched from the DB, and when it is fetched from the DB, the records are considered to be clean, to be valid. So that is the reason they are not validated. Now let's see, we have defined a validation rule over here. Okay, it's an entity level validation. So when you try to modify something over here, let's say I just delete this L. Okay, now as I tab out, my validation ran. Okay, and it ran fine just because of the fact, if you count the characters, 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10, so these are basically 10, so our validation fired well. It was like this L. Let's suppose I add 1 into this. Now if I tab out, my validation fired and it says length should be less than or equal to 10 characters. So the thing to understand from here is that attribute level validation will get fired when you try to modify them and tab out. Okay, so this is attribute level validation over here. Okay, now I will show you how this kind of a validation looks like on a page. Okay, so I will go ahead and create one page, one simple JSF page. I will just go with the default settings, create a blank page. Now I will just have this employee over here as ADF form, and I will just enable all these things and click OK. So it will render. Now what I will do, I will just save all and try to run this, and I'll just try to show you how this all thing, I mean this validation over the first name, looks like at the UI at the page side. So here is our page output, and you can scroll through the records over here. Okay, now we defined a validation over here, so let's enter something greater than 10. Okay, it's greater than 10. Now what will happen if I try to tab out here? See, nothing is happening. Okay, just count it out. 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10. Yes, it is greater than 10, but it's still not. If we are tapping it out, our validation is not getting fired, right? Just try to click submit. I'm trying to update this record. When you click submit, now the error comes. Now our validation has fired that length should be less than or equal to 10 characters. So why it is happening? Why it is not actually trying to trigger when I'm trying to tab out? Okay, it is because this is an input box. This is a text box kind of a thing which has been provided to you over the page. When you enter some value over here, and when you tab out, then this value is not at all hitting the server. That's the reason when it is not submitting, this page is not submitting this value when you tab it out. Okay, so when this value doesn't go to the server, doesn't hit the server, so ADF doesn't triggers that attribute level validation that we declared on this. But if you click on submit, whatever value is written over here hits the server, and then ADF knows that this value is greater than 10 and I should fire the validation defined. Okay, so if there is any way that if you try to tab it out, then only our validation should fire. If there is any way we can enable that way, and then that kind of a thing, that kind of a functionality will be implemented, that if we tab it out here, then only our validation gets fired. Okay, so there is a property here. If you go to the first name, click over here. Here's the first name. Okay, in the structure window, here is the property inspector. So if you try to search one property, this is auto submit. Right now auto submit is set to false. I will set it to true. When you set this to true, what does that mean? It means that whatever value has been provided by the user, as the user tries to tab out, as the user tries to put the cursor from this input text to some other input text, this value gets submitted to the server. This value hits the server. So if we are making this value hitting the server, then obviously ADF will get this value and will try to trigger our validation rule. So let's just save this and try to rerun it. Then we will see how our validation gets fired. So this is our output page. I will just try to increase the length of this first name. Now I'll try to tab out from here. As I tab out, you see a red button, a red kind of outline over here. That means our validation has fired. Now if you try to come over here, it will show you this error, length should be less than or equal to 10 characters. So it's all about the auto submit field. Okay, so now I will just stop my server. I will close this. So the thing to note from here is that auto submit property should be set to true if we want to submit its value automatically to hit the server in order to trigger the validation that we have defined. Okay, so now this is a kind of a declarative validation that we have defined, attribute level declarative validation that we have defined. Now as of now we were changing the value from the UI or from the model tester. Let's say I am changing the value programmatically, then also this validation will get fired. Let's say that I go to this app module, I create a Java class, okay, or this, and I go to this class, and so and I define a method over here, try to update. Okay, what this does, this gets the employee's VO and sets the where clause that for this employee ID, and as you see in the database, for this employee ID, this is the first name already existing. Now I try to set this attribute to something which is greater than 10 characters. Okay, and then I commit the change. So let's see that when we try to invoke this method, then what happens? Does the attribute level validation gets fired or not? And I would say that that will get fired. Okay, now I will just expose this method so that we should be able to see it and run it. Just save all and run the model tester itself. As you see over here, go to the app module, here's our method, click execute, and oops, yes, see, our validation got fired. It said length should be less than or equal to 10 characters because our program was trying to set some value which was greater than the 10 characters. And even if you see the database, if you refresh over here, the value has not updated over here, right? So that's how it goes. And this was about attribute level validation. Now let's see that we delete this validation. Okay, I remove this validation. I can define the same kind of a validation on entity also. I will say length of first name should be less than or equal to characters 10. So what it says first name should be less than or equal to 10 characters. That's it. And I will say the message. Here is our message that I define. I click OK. The only difference is it's the same validator. The only difference is that previously I had it in the attribute level. Right now I had it in entity level validation. So what's the difference? Let's run it and see. So here is our employees. Okay, now we define entity level validation over here. Previously we had attribute level validation. So in attribute level validation, if you try to change this if you try to make this if you try to make first name to contain more than 10 characters, and if you tab it out, our validation was getting fired. And one thing I forgot to tell you over there in the attribute level validation, that even if you try to change over here, if you try to make it some number of characters which is greater than 10 characters, and you don't tab out here, you just click validate also, then also our attribute level validation would get fired. Okay, that demonstration I just forgot to show you, but that's true that if it is an entity level validation, and if you just go ahead and try to violate that over here, if you tab it out, it will get triggered, and even if you try to validate or try to save the changes, then also it would get triggered. That's an attribute level validation. But right now we have defined entity level validation over here. So what entity level validation will do, see, I define a first name which is greater than 10 characters. I tab it out, nothing happens, right? And when I click validate, then only it gives me this error. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that you try to make this dirty and this will get fired. If you click over here, you will see something called as validation execution. So here it defines that when you change, here are all the attributes that are present over here, and it says triggering attributes execute only if one of the selected attribute has been changed. So I have already, there is first name selected by default because we define it over the first name only, so that attribute will be present over here by default. Now what it is saying that when you change this attribute and you click validate or you try to submit, that is to say if you try to update, then fire this validation rule. Okay, you don't have to fire this when you tab it out. Okay, you have to fire only when the entity on a whole becomes dirty. And when it is decided that it becomes dirty, it is decided when this attribute of the entity becomes changed or modified. That is to say, we are defining here that the entity becomes dirty only and only when this attribute is getting changed. And when entity is getting changed or modified or is becoming dirty, then fire this validation rule. Okay, I can also include this email over here. Okay, so now what will happen if you try to change any one of these and you try to click on validate or you try to click on save changes, then the attribute the validation would get fired. See, I will show you. Just run this. So go on employees. So right now we had defined that fire the validation if this one or this one, any one of these changes, and we click on validate or save changes, right? Now let's say that I define here, see, I will scroll through the records. I will come to a record which is having this name. Okay, this is already this is already actually exceeding 10 characters of limit. If you click validate over here, nothing will happen right now because this record has just been fetched from the DB, so it is considered as a valid record. So that's why our validation won't get fired. It will get fired only if you try to change this or this. See, it is already existing 10 characters. Right now I will not change this. I will try to change the email. Okay, as I try to change the email, you remember that email was also selected over there, right? So as I have modified email, it tells that boss, this entity on a whole has become dirty now. Okay, because we changed the email. If you try to change any one of the first name or the email, it will become dirty. So now we have changed this email, this has become dirty, this entity has become dirty. If you try to tab it out, nothing will happen. because it's an entity level validation. If you try to click on validate, then our validation will get fired. It will show you first name should be less than or equal to 10 characters. That's because we define that email also in the attribute list. We define that when the email also gets modified, fire the validation, right? So these are the things to remember, that validation execution, you can define the attributes based on which an entity can be considered as dirty, and due to which if entity becomes dirty, then only fire the validation. And here the validation will not get fired when you tab out. It will only get fired when you submit or validate the changes. Okay, so that is something about the entity level of the validation. Now I will try to show you what's actually a transaction level of validation. Okay, so see, this attribute level and entity level, this entity level validation, whatever you apply, it will be per entity. Okay, but the transaction level of the validation is applicable when these all validations have finished. Okay, and when the data is actually going to be persisted in the DB. So that's the moment when transactional level validation gets fired, if you have them in your thing. So first thing to remember, I'll just remove this validation from here which we created. So first thing to remember is that validation, this transaction level validation is only valid. You can use it only when you have method validators or you have key exist kind of a validator. Okay, so let's just create a simple validator, key exist validator over here, so that I can show you what's transactional level. Okay, we create entity level new validator, we say key exist, or you can define this key exist from here also. I want to define that this department ID, right? New validator, I will say key exist, and you have the option to just check it, select from here. I will say select it from the entity object, and I will say this EMP, this kind of association I want to use, and this attribute will be taken from this entity, and this will be validated from this target. Okay, so what it says that in the target I want to have some department ID over here in this entity, which is already present in the target over here. Okay, and in the validation execution, if you go I'm sorry, this is a key exist kind of a validation that we are defining, right? So key exist, we define foreign key. Okay, entity level. Okay, failure handling. So here basically when you're defining this kind of validation, you are telling that whatever department ID is present over here, it should be present, it should already be present in the department ID of the department table. Okay, so department ID not found. Okay, this kind of a thing you can just implement and see it will work fine. I already shown you this thing in my previous tutorial. The only thing is here in the validation execution, there is no tick mark that is over there to provide you that whether it's a transaction level or not. Okay, that's because we have been defining over here it on the an attribute level. Okay, on the attribute level you are not seeing any such thing in the validation execution, so I'll just cancel it. Okay, I will try to define the same validation but as an entity level from here. When you do that, you say key exist and you select this association. This is the same thing which I defined over here as attribute level. Now if you go to the validation execution, it says defer execution to transaction level. So I'll select this now. What it says that this kind of a validation, do this kind of validation after all the other attribute level and entity level validations have been done. Okay, failure handling, I would say department ID not found in departments. Okay, validation, and it gets triggered only when you try to change this department ID. That's fine, click OK, and our attribute is, our validation is ready. Just so here is our employee table. Now I try to give an entity 901. Okay, we know that this department ID doesn't even exist in the department table. If you try to tab out, nothing happens because there's the validation that we defined was not an attribute level. If you click on validate, then also nothing happens because this transaction level validation won't get fired now. If you try to click save the changes, then only this gets fired, because that's a transactional level of validation, and it says department ID not found in departments. Okay, so that's how transactional level of the validation works. The key thing to remember is that this kind of a validation, if you check this over here, this will be fired only and only after all other attribute level and entity level validation have been executed. Okay, so I will see you in the next tutorial. I hope I